The letter arrived on a perfect June morning, the kind that made Richard Mercer grateful he'd invested his life savings in the lakefront property. Sunlight dappled the calm waters of Lake Evergreen, and a pair of ospreys circled overhead as he stood at the end of his private dock, coffee in hand. It was the sort of tranquil moment that had convinced him to retire early and move to Evergreen Shores, until he opened the certified envelope with the Homeowners Association logo embossed in pretentious gold foil. Notice of violation. Unauthorized watercraft storage and access, Richard read aloud, his voice rising with each word. This is ridiculous. The letter, signed by HOA President Eleanor Pittman, informed him that his 22-foot fishing boat was in violation of recently amended Bylaw 7.3, and that he had 30 days to remove it from the property or face daily fines of $250. Furthermore, the private dock that had been part of his property for 40 years, long before the HOA even existed, was now deemed an unauthorized structure requiring immediate removal. Richard's hands trembled, not from his 65 years of age, but from the fury building inside him. He purchased this property specifically for the dock and direct lake access. Every weekend for the past 3 years since moving in, he'd taken his grandson Theo fishing. The boy was coming tomorrow for his summer visit, 2 whole months of teaching him to fish, navigate, and appreciate the outdoors. The dock and boat were central to everything Richard had planned. Inside, he spread the HOA documents across his kitchen table. A sticky note was attached to the back page. Nothing personal, Richard. Rules are rules. A leaner. But it felt extremely personal. Eleanor Pittman had been trying to acquire Richard's lot since he'd outbid her at the estate sale 3 years ago. Her property sat adjacent to his, and she'd made no secret of wanting to expand her already sprawling lakeside mansion. Richard picked up his phone and called his neighbor, Frank Winters. They can't possibly enforce this, Richard said after explaining the situation. I had my boat here since day one, and the dock was here decades before any of these McMansions. Frank's long sigh told Richard everything. They amended the bylaws at last month's meeting. You weren't there, and neither was I. We were both at that fishing tournament in Cedar Creek. Eleanor pushed through a bunch of changes. Technically, only she and her committee can have boat access now. Something about preserving shoreline aesthetics and environmental concerns. That's absurd. Half the residents have boats. Had boats, Frank corrected. Most people already got similar letters. The Johnsons and the Pat Hills already removed theirs. Everyone's furious, but nobody wants to fight Eleanor. She's got 3 lawyers on the HOA board. Richard stared out the window at his boat gently rocking against the dock. This isn't about aesthetics or the environment. She's cutting off lake access for everyone except her inner circle. Well, there's one thing. Frank hesitated. You know that spring-fed creek that runs through your property into the lake? What about it? It's the main spawning route for the lake's bass population. If something were to happen to that creek access, Richard's eyes widened as understanding dawned. His property contained the only viable entry point for the lake's prize bass to reach their spawning grounds. Eleanor and her husband Henry hosted the annual Evergreen Shores Fishing Tournament, a prestigious event that brought in wealthy participants and significant publicity for Eleanor's real estate business. Frank, I think I need to review my property survey very carefully, Richard said slowly, a plan forming. And maybe have a conversation with the Department of Natural Resources about riparian rights. After hanging up, Richard walked back to his dock, this time seeing his modest property with new eyes. Eleanor might have the HOA in her pocket, but Richard had something far more valuable: control over the future of Lake Evergreen's entire fishing ecosystem. If Eleanor wanted a war over water access, he would give her one that would make her regret the day she messed with a retired marine biologist's fishing plans with his grandson. He smiled grimly as he ran his hand along the boat's hull. Nothing personal, Eleanor, he muttered. Rules are rules. Richard spent the next morning combing through 40 years of property records and surveys, spreading them across his dining room table like battle plans. His property deed clearly stated that his land extended to the water's edge with all riparian rights thereto, including the natural creek that meandered through his backyard before emptying into Lake Evergreen. When the doorbell rang around noon, Richard was deep in research on state water regulations. He opened the door to find Theo standing there, fishing rod in hand, an eager smile on his face. Behind him, Richard's daughter Sarah was unloading camping gear from her SUV. Grandpa. Theo launched himself at Richard. Can we go fishing right now? I've been practicing my casting. Richard hugged his 10-year-old grandson tightly. We sure can, buddy, but first we need to talk about a little problem we're having with some neighbors. After Sarah left, promising to return in August, Richard showed Theo the dock and explained the situation in terms the boy could understand. So these mean people want to take away our fishing spot? Theo asked, his lower lip trembling slightly. They're trying, Richard admitted. But your grandpa has a plan. How would you like to help me with a science project this summer? Theo's eyes lit up. Like the frog habitat we made last year. Even better. This time, we're going to protect an entire fish population. The next morning, Richard called the Department of Natural Resources and requested a site visit from a wildlife officer. He also reached out to 3 different environmental law firms, meticulously documenting every conversation. By afternoon, he and Theo were walking the property line with a surveyor Richard had hired. The surveyor confirmed what Richard already suspected. The creek and its banks, 15 feet on either side, fell entirely within Richard's property. More importantly, the small wooden bridge that connected Eleanor's expansive backyard to the community nature trail crossed directly over the creek on Richard's land. That bridge has been there forever, Richard told the surveyor. I never minded people using it, but technically, it's an encroachment on your property, the surveyor confirmed, making notes on his tablet, and any modifications to the waters would require environmental impact studies and permits. Richard smiled. I'd like that noted in your official report, please. That evening, Eleanor's Mercedes pulled into Richard's driveway. She approached his porch with the practiced smile of someone used to getting her way. Her expensive linen outfit is stark contrast to Richard's worn jeans and fishing shirt. Richard, I hope you received our notice, she said without preamble. The HOA board is very serious about these new regulations. They'll benefit everyone in the long run. Everyone except those of us who bought lakefront property specifically for lake access, Richard replied calmly. Eleanor's smile tightened. The amendments passed with majority support. Your dock must be removed by the end of the month. Interesting timing, right before your annual fishing tournament, Richard remarked, watching her reaction carefully. The tournament has nothing to do with this, she said, but her eyes shifted away. It's about property values and environmental preservation. Speaking of environmental preservation, Richard said, I have the DNR out here this morning. Did you know the creek on my property is a protected spawning ground and that your bridge was built without proper permits? The color drained from Eleanor's face. That bridge has been there for 20 years. Illegally, as it turns out. Richard leaned forward. If you want to talk about unauthorized structures, we should start there. Eleanor's composure cracked. The tournament brings in thousands of dollars for the community. Henry has already collected registration fees from 60 anglers. Then I suggest you reconsider your position on my boat and dock, Richard said. Because according to state law, I have every right to fence my property line, including the creek. You wouldn't, Eleanor hissed. I wasn't planning to, Richard replied honestly, until I received your letter. Now I'm considering all my options. After Eleanor left, stomping down his driveway in her expensive shoes, Richard sat on his porch swing with Theo, watching the sunset over the lake. Did you win, Grandpa? Theo asked. Richard put his arm around his grandson's shoulders. Not yet, buddy, but we just made our first move. That night, Richard drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, copying the DNR and the county environmental office. He outlined the legal issues with the new bylaws, the unauthorized bridge, and the protected status of the spawning creek. For good measure, he included photographs of Eleanor's gardener dumping fertilizer dangerously close to the lake, another clear violation of environmental regulations. As he sealed the envelope, Richard knew the battle was just beginning. 3 days after Richard sent his letter to the HOA board, an official-looking SUV pulled up to his house. A woman in a Department of Natural Resources uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. Mr. Mercer, I'm Officer Diane Chen, DNR Environmental Protection Division. I understand you have concerns about a protected waterway on your property. Richard invited her in and offered coffee. I appreciate you coming out so quickly. Let me show you what we're dealing with. He led Officer Chen through his property to the creek. Theo trailed behind him, notebook in hand. Richard had suggested he document their science project like a real researcher. Officer Chen knelt by the creek, taking water samples and photographs. This is definitely a critical habitat. Our records show this is the primary spawning channel for 4 species of game fish in Lake Evergreen. She gestured towards the bridge on Eleanor's property. And that structure was never permitted through our office. What about the new HOA regulations? Richard asked. Can they legally restrict dock access for most residents? Officer Chen made notes on her clipboard. There are state protections for established riparian rights. I need to consult with our legal department, but if your dock existed before the regulations and meets safety standards, they may have overstepped. After Officer Chen left, promising a formal assessment within the week, Richard received a text from Frank. Emergency HOA meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Eleanor's on the warpath. Richard arrived at the community center to find the room packed. Eleanor stood at the podium, Henry hovering nearby like an expensive shadow. When Richard entered, conversations hushed momentarily before erupting into whispers. Now that everyone's here, Eleanor said pointedly, we could address this situation. She held up Richard's letter. Mr. Mercer has made some serious accusations about our new waterfront regulations. They're not accusations, Richard replied calmly. They're facts. The creek on my property is protected habitat, and restricting established dock access violates state waterway access laws. Eleanor's smile was brittle. Our legal counsel assures us that HOA has full authority to regulate structures on all properties within our community. Richard pulled out a folder. I have 3 legal opinions that say otherwise, and the DNR officer who visited today was quite concerned about the unauthorized bridge on your property, Eleanor. Murmurs spread through the room. Eleanor's face flushed. This is ridiculous, she snapped. That bridge has historical precedent. And may I remind everyone that the annual fishing tournament brings in substantial revenue for our community projects. About that tournament, Richard said, addressing the crowd rather than Eleanor. Did you know the bass population that attracts those fishermen spawns exclusively in the creek that runs through my property? The room fell silent. Eleanor and Henry exchanged glances. What exactly are you suggesting? Henry asked, his voice tight. Richard shrugged. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply informing the community that, as the legal owner of that land, I have every right to fence my property line. For safety reasons, of course. You would jeopardize the tournament out of spite? Eleanor's voice rose. No more than you jeopardize my property rights out of greed, Richard countered. Let's be honest, Eleanor. This isn't about aesthetics or environment. It's about limiting lake access to your friends while my dock supposedly ruins your view. Several residents nodded. Frank spoke up from the back. Richard's right. Most of us bought here specifically for lake access. The amendment passed fairly, Eleanor insisted. At a meeting scheduled during the annual fishing tournament, when you knew many of us would be absent, Richard pointed out, including 4 board members who since told me they would have voted against it. The meeting evolved into heated debate. Richard noticed several residents whispering and looking his way with newfound respect. He'd struck a nerve. Many had accepted Eleanor's rules without question for too long. As Richard left the meeting, the HOA treasurer, Mitch Gonzalez, caught up with him in the parking lot. For what it's worth, I never supported these amendments, Mitch said quietly. Eleanor pushed them through while Henry distracted us with budget discussions. But she's got most of the board in her pocket. They either work for her real estate company or owe her favors. Why are you telling me this? Richard asked. Because the tournament brings in $80,000 in registration fees and sponsorships. Eleanor skims at least half for administrative costs before any money reaches community projects. Mitch glanced around nervously. Check the HOA financial records for the last 3 years. They're public documents, but nobody ever looks at them. The next morning, Richard and Theo began what Richard called habitat enhancement. They planted native vegetation along the creek banks and installed small signs reading protected spawning habitat, no trespassing at regular intervals, including directly beside Eleanor's bridge. By noon, Eleanor's lawyer had called demanding the signs be removed. Richard politely informed him that the signs were on his property according to the survey and suggested the lawyer take up any concerns with the DNR. That afternoon, while Theo was napping, Richard visited the county clerk's office to examine the HOA financial records. What he found made his blood boil. The tournament proceeds had indeed been misappropriated. Not just skimmed, but actively funneled into a separate account controlled solely by Eleanor and Henry. Two can play this game, Richard muttered as he photographed the incriminating documents with his phone. When he returned home, Richard found a crew of workers on his. The morning after Eleanor's crew removed his signs, Richard sat at his kitchen table with Theo, maps and scientific journals spread between them. He'd spent half the night researching legal precedents and ecological interventions. Are we still doing our science project, Grandpa? Theo asked, munching on cereal. We are, but we need to make some adjustments, Richard replied. Sometimes in science, you have to adapt your methods when faced with obstacles. Richard pointed to a detailed map of the creek. See this bend here? It's the perfect spot for what we need to do. Theo leaned forward eagerly. What's that? A fish ladder. Richard showed Theo a diagram. It's a structure that helps fish swim upstream past obstacles. Completely legal, environmentally beneficial, and, he smiled, extremely effective at controlling water flow. After breakfast, Richard called a former colleague from his university days, now a respected environmental consultant. Jim, I need your professional opinion on a fish ladder installation, Richard explained the situation. Sounds like a textbook case for riparian rights protection, Jim said. I can be there tomorrow to assess the site. This HOA sounds like a nightmare. Bring your official letterhead, Richard suggested. And if you happen to know anyone at the Environmental Protection Agency who might be interested in a potential Clean Water Act violation, I'd appreciate an introduction. The next day, Jim arrived with an assistant and spent hours taking measurements and soil samples around the creek. Eleanor watched from her property line, phone pressed to her ear. She's calling her lawyers, Jim noted with amusement. Let her, Richard replied. "Everything we're doing is by the book." By evening, Richard had permits in hand for a conservation and fish habitat improvement project. The county environmental office had fast-tracked his application after Jim's enthusiastic endorsement. 3 days later, a small construction crew began work on Richard's property. They installed a series of concrete steps in the creek, a legitimate fish ladder that would help the bass navigate upstream during spawning season. What wasn't immediately obvious was that Richard had designed this system with a subtle modification: adjustable flow gates that could be completely closed if necessary. Eleanor and Henry strode across the lawn as the crew was finishing up, a sheriff's deputy trailing behind them. "This is harassment," Eleanor shouted. "He's deliberately interfering with water flow to sabotage the tournament." The deputy looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I checked with the county. He has all the proper permits for this structure." "It's a conservation project," Richard explained innocently. "I'm simply helping the fish reach their spawning grounds more efficiently." He handed the deputy a glossy pamphlet Jim had prepared, complete with scientific citations and approval stamps from 3 environmental agencies. "This appears to be an order," the deputy said, handing the pamphlet back. "Ma'am, there's nothing illegal happening here." Eleanor's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over, Richard. The tournament starts in 2 weeks, and those fish had better be able to reach the lake." "Nature takes its course," Richard replied calmly. "I can't control when fish decide to spawn." After they left, Theo, who had been watching from behind Richard, asked, "Can you really control when the fish spawn, Grandpa?" Richard knelt to his grandson's level. "Not exactly, buddy. But fish respond to environmental cues: water temperature, flow rates, oxygen levels. Change those factors and you can influence their behavior." The next morning, Richard implemented phase 2 of his plan. He and Theo began collecting water samples daily, carefully documenting temperature, pH levels, and clarity, all perfectly normal activities for a former marine biologist teaching his grandson about science. What Eleanor couldn't see was that each evening, Richard adjusted the flow gates on his fish ladder, gradually reducing the water flow to the lake while still allowing enough movement to keep the creek healthy. A week before the tournament, Richard received a certified letter from the HOA demanding immediate removal of the fish ladder. It cited a previously unenforced bylaw prohibiting structural modifications to natural waterways. Richard smiled as he read it. Interesting how they suddenly care about natural waterways when it suits them. He drafted a response pointing out that his fish ladder had county and state approval, unlike Eleanor's bridge, and that removing it now would violate multiple environmental protection laws. For good measure, he attached copies of the financial records showing the misappropriation of tournament funds. 3 days before the tournament, panic set in among the HOA leadership. Test runs by local fishermen had yielded almost no bass in the lake. The fish had retreated upstream to the spawning areas in Richard's Creek, areas now carefully regulated by his fish ladder. Henry Pittman himself knocked on Richard's door late that evening. "Richard, let's be reasonable," Henry said, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "We have 60 anglers arriving from across the country. Some of them are major sponsors of Eleanor's real estate business." "Sounds like a personal problem," Richard replied. "What will it take?" Henry asked bluntly. "Name your price." Richard leaned against his doorframe. "It's not about money, Henry. It's about principle. Eleanor tried to cut off my lake access and destroy my retirement plans with my grandson." "The amendment can be reversed," Henry offered quickly. "We can call an emergency meeting tomorrow, and my dock stays right where it is, permanently protected in the bylaws." Yes, Henry agreed. "We can grandfather in all existing docks." Richard pretended to consider this. "That's a start. But there's also the matter of the tournament funds being misappropriated. The community deserves transparency." Henry paled. "That's a separate issue." "Not to me," Richard said firmly. "Full financial audit of the HOA books going back 5 years, conducted by an independent accountant of my choosing." "You can't be serious." "As a heart attack," Richard replied. "Oh, and one more thing. Eleanor resigns from the HOA board. Effective immediately." Henry's face hardened. "She'll never agree to that." "Then I guess those bass will just have to stay upstream during the tournament. Fish are funny creatures. Sometimes they just don't feel like swimming downstream." As Henry stomped back to his car, Richard heard a soft giggle behind him. Theo stood in the hallway in his pajamas. "You're really sticking it to the mean people, Grandpa," he said with admiration. Richard ruffled his grandson's hair. "Sometimes, buddy, you have to stand up to bullies, even when they hide behind fancy titles and legal documents." The next morning, an emergency community meeting was called. The room was packed, not just with homeowners, but with tournament participants who had arrived early and were now worried about the event being canceled. Eleanor avoided Richard's gaze as she announced that the HOA board had reconsidered the dock amendment in light of community feedback. All existing docks would be permanently grandfathered into the bylaws. Richard raised his hand. And the financial audit? A hush fell over the room. Eleanor's knuckles whitened around the podium. An independent audit has been scheduled, she said through clenched teeth, and I will be stepping down as president once the new board elections are complete next month.